Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Vasuki Shastri. I'm an associate fellow here at Chatham House. Delighted to welcome you to this webinar on US-China tensions, implications for the Asia-Pacific. Today's session is on the record. At the outset, I'd like to thank AIG for supporting this four-part webinar series. Today is the second part, really looking at the broad issue of Asia-Pacific in a dynamic world, where we are exploring economic, certainly today we're going to talk about geopolitics. And we've got subsequent sessions looking at climate, technological disruption, and certainly the role of Australia in the region. Now, Stephen Barnett, the CEO of Asia Pacific, unfortunately could not join today. He has sent me a short note, which I will read, and then I will introduce our speakers, and then we'll head straight to the session. Stephen Barnett says, AIG is a long-standing partner of Chatham House and a supporter of the Asia Pacific program. So AIG is very pleased to collaborate with Chatham House on this webinar series. Chatham House experts and guests will analyze how the region should best prepare for the post-pandemic future. Discussions in this series will highlight the role of business and social actors in ensuring that the Asia-Pacific region remains an engine of growth and innovation after COVID-19. It is important that companies and communities across the region can anticipate and mitigate risk, achieve resilience in the face of economic and geopolitical uncertainty, as well as the challenge of pandemics and climate change. These are critical subjects for AIG, a major insurer in the region. Now for our speakers, we've had two contrasting visuals when we look at the US-China relationship in the age of Biden. So we have this very rancorous videotape out of the Alaska summit where senior US diplomats and senior Chinese officials had a contentious meeting in the full view of cameras. And a few weeks later, we had this sight of John Kerry, Joe Biden's climate envoy, showing up in China in order to get China's support and collaboration. Glasgow summit in November to discuss climate change. And so we're going to discuss both the strategic competitive nature of US-China relations. We'll also look at the collaborative nature. We'll explore in depth how the region is viewing these developments and how the region is trying to position itself. So we've got a terrific list of panelists to help us navigate this issue today. Bilahari Kaushikam, former top diplomat for Singapore, currently chairman of the Middle East Institute. We have UGA, who's senior research fellow here at Chatham House, focusing on China. And we have Charles Freeman, who's a senior vice president for Asia at the US Chamber of Commerce in Washington, DC. We'll start. Each speaker will have about 8 minutes to deliver opening remarks. We hope to keep this as interactive as possible. So if you could please start sending me questions, I'll try to organize them. You can be contentious, you can be controversial, but one thing that I can guarantee is all of our speakers are going to be incredibly insightful today. So Bilahari, can I start with you to get your insights, and then we'll go to the other speakers.
Thanks, Vasuki. I will be as brief as I can. I'm going to make 3 points. First, obviously, US-China relations have entered a new phase, and the importance of this relationship is so great that it will color most aspects of international relations for the foreseeable future. Now, from 1972 to around 2012, the overall emphasis of the relationship was on engagement. Of course, there were periods of tension over Taiwan, over human rights, and over some other issues. And of course, competition is inherent in any great power relationship, but the overall trajectory was towards engagement. Now, the overall trajectory is towards competition. Engagement will not cease, and they will cooperate when interests coincide, as they may over climate change, as you mentioned. But that does not detract from the overall trajectory. And it is clear that the Biden administration will essentially carry on the Trump administration's approach towards China. Of course, with no unnecessary drama, a more orderly process of policy making and communication, and more consultation with allies and partners. All this is to be welcomed, but it is essentially the same policy. Second, despite its centrality to contemporary international relations, describing this new phase in US-China relations, as so many people have, as a new Cold War is an intellectually lazy and inaccurate trope that fundamentally misrepresents the relationship. In principle, the US and the former Soviet Union led two separate systems that were connected only at the margins. US-Soviet Cold War competition was over which system would prevail. By contrast, the US and China are both vital and irreplaceable components of a single global system. Their competition is to determine who will dominate this single global system. Now, competition within a system is fundamentally different from competition between different systems. Domestically, there are, of course, crucial differences between the authoritarian communist Chinese system and the liberal democratic American system. But it has been a very long time since anyone could really hope or fear that the communist planned economy will replace the free market American economy. The US and China are both mixed economies. There are differences being in the balance between the planned, or as they call it in the West, the regulated elements of the economy and the free market elements. Now, the different balances between these elements are significant, of course, and the US and China each have their own strengths and weaknesses in their respective balances. But we should not lose sight of the fact that their differences are of degree, not of kind. This is perhaps more obvious to a small country like mine that is neither authoritarian in the Chinese mode nor liberal democratic in the American mode, and which has had occasion to call a plague on both houses. Moreover, within the single global system, the US and China are enmeshed with each other and to other components of the system, say Europe or Japan, by a web of supply chains of a scope, of a density, and of a complexity that is historically unprecedented. Nothing quite like it has ever existed before in the global economy. This is interdependence of a qualitatively new kind. Needless to say, interdependence does not create trust. On the contrary, it is a source of mistrust as it exposes mutual vulnerabilities. Now, there are several important implications of what I just said. First of all, the scope, complexity, and density of the web spun by these supply chains make it extremely improbable that, whatever their intentions, the US and China can ever decouple or bifurcate into two entirely separate systems. Bifurcation of a fair degree in some specific domains has occurred. The internet, for example, has largely separated, and bifurcation of some degree may occur in some other domains, 5G, for instance. But complete across the board bifurcation across all domains is well nigh impossible at any acceptable cost. And these are both rational countries. These supply chains are therefore simultaneously the instruments of competition, as well as shape and constrain the competition. It complicates the competition, and under these conditions, the choices are seldom binary or straightforward. Unless we be disheartened, we meaning the third countries, the third parties, lest we be disheartened by these complexities, let me point out that in complexity, there is always agency, if only we have the wit to recognize it and the courage to use it. Now, the consequence of these 2 points I've just made is to make ambivalence the characteristic attitude of this new phase of international relations. Ambivalence characterizes the way the US and China regard each other, and ambivalence characterizes the way third countries regard both of them. No one wants to make an enemy of either the US or China. Maybe Putin's Russia is a slight exception, but neither is anyone without concern about both China and the US, although, of course, the nature and intensity of concerns are not similar. Nobody will completely or unreservedly commit to either the US or China, or neatly align interests across all domains with either. Sometimes we will lean one way, sometimes we will tilt the other way, and sometimes we will go our own way. The result will be greater complexity in international relationships and to encourage the emergence of a multipolar international order, an asymmetric multipolar international order. Not all poles will be equal. Third and finally, this phase of US-China relations is the consequence of the shedding of illusions, or perhaps more accurately described as delusions, on both sides. On both sides, domestic politics is in charge and neither wants to appear weak to their own people and third countries. The 1972 opening to China was based on cold, realpolitik calculations. But after the end of the Cold War, and in particular after China's ascension to the WTO in 2001, the delusion that economic reform would necessarily lead to at least some degree of political convergence took hold. It was bound to end in tears. Having once deceived themselves, it would be difficult for anyone important in the adversarial US political system to advocate a more balanced view without incurring serious political costs. I doubt that any politically important American figure really wants to change course, at least not at present. On Chinese side, towards the end of the Hu Jintao era, around 2012, 2010, 2012, as I mentioned, the global financial crisis led the Chinese to drink far too much of their own Kool-Aid and believe their own propaganda about America's inevitable and absolute decline. To be sure, the US has its problems, serious problems, but so has China, and the adjustments in the global distribution of power that are underway are relative, not absolute. It was a strategic mistake for Mr. Xi Jinping to have prematurely abandoned Deng Xiaoping's sage approach of hiding light and biding time. Once revealed, ambitions will not be easily forgotten, and this accounts for the failures of Chinese diplomacy around the world, most significantly in relations with the US. But Mr. Xi is never going to admit his mistake, and who is going to tell him he made a mistake? Well, to reset their relationship, both sides will have to craft a narrative of victory that will be credible to their respective domestic audiences. I don't see this happening anytime soon, if ever. But to end on a slightly more optimistic note, I think war by design, and I emphasize war by design, is so highly improbable as for all practical purposes to be impossible. The so-called Thucydides trap is a particularly stupid theory emblematic of all that is wrong with the academic study of international relations. Accidents can of course happen in the South or East China Seas or in the Taiwan Straits, but I think both sides will do their best to contain accidents. Although it will be much harder to contain an accident in the Taiwan Straits than elsewhere, nuclear deterrence will keep the peace between the US and China as it did between the US and the Soviet Union. Indeed, you may recall that some academics call the Cold War the long peace. I'll end here. I'll shut up and end here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bilahari. That was an excellent framing of the issue, particularly from the perspective of how other countries in the region really are watching this spectacle, this geopolitical theater. Yuji, I'd like to come to you now from all the research and conversations you've had on China. You know, the points raised by Bilahari, you know, does that resonate in Beijing, or is Beijing fundamentally looking at this issue from a completely different perspective?
So let me hold the microphone here. I mean, by no way I can compete with Bilahari's eloquence in here. But what I'm saying is, over the weekend, I was just reading the Qiushi magazine. This is the Chinese Communist Party political elite publishing their key speeches there. And one of the key speech made by Xi Jinping in the 11th of January earlier this year suggests this one paragraph that it seems to be everything in this world could be summarized within the word of chaos, and therefore the East is rising and the West is in decline. And this first part of the sentence has been widely reported and covered in the Western media, to suggesting that China now having this enormous triumphant confidence, it seems to manage to pulling off a reasonable economic recovery and also make the pandemic under control. But the second half of the sentence, which referring to, and I quote in here, is suggesting that China facing unprecedented challenge, which China have not seen in the past few decades. So clearly what this tells me is that it really tells me the Chinese leadership somehow believe within this a really strong insecurity in this deeper inner heart of this competition with United States. And that seems to be going to continue for quite some time. So that really is going to bring us to a protracted period of conflicts between the two titans. And also this reminds me, perhaps the Chinese leadership really acknowledge that China still stands a sizable distance from the #1 world power. So having said all of that, and what does that mean to China's relationship with the United States and China's relationship with larger part of Asia Pacific? I think what we can gauge is we can gauge from the latest, the 14th five-year plan that has been issued by the Chinese government. It introduced this whole ideas of the so-called dual circulation, which is somehow to promote domestic consumption and also is to boosting domestic economy to have the ability to power itself. But I think the key word in here, it is not circulation. The key word in here is dual. Dual, which means that China does not really necessarily want to run an isolationist economy, because the key thing in here is having China entangled itself in both the regional trade structure and also global trading system, and that would really benefiting China's economic, its own economic development model too. So put in this case, given the recent signature of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, it really shows that Beijing's strategy is surely not isolationist, and much of the emphasis will be given back to the so-called periphery diplomacy, which is to say, a focus of China's immediate neighbor, and therefore the Asian economy become absolutely crucial for China's next steps of economic development. So I think what we have seen so far is that sense of China's pivot, China's own version of pivot back to Asia Pacific, and less focusing on, for example, Eastern Europe and Latin America, like what China has done in the past few years regarding the Belt and Road Initiative. I think more so that China would give emphasis on crafting some kind of even closer economic ties with the Asian Pacific economy in order to handle the highs and lows on its relationship with the United States. So, obviously, China is really deeply embedded within the regional trading platform, and China is actually a larger trading partner than the United States, than every single country in the region except Bhutan. So across the region, that country obviously really have to strike a fine balance between maintaining a beneficial security ties with the United States, but also close trading partnership with China, as what Bahalari outlined earlier. But there's also indeed a growing concern among ASEAN members to see, even though there's a positivity on China's economic strength, but also what brings in the danger in here is that the growing concern of China's military might built within the region. And these two, economic might and military might, perhaps will go hands in hands, both for the case of the United States, as well as for the case of Beijing in here. So for the solution for China, what China can do, perhaps the renewed effort would be given to build some sense of a sustainable infrastructure within the Asia Pacific region, and also offer scientifically proven and also accessible Chinese vaccine to help those Asian economies to get out of this pandemic as quick as possible. And perhaps that's the way to constructing a healthy competition between China and the United States. And lastly, just very quickly, Beijing also introduced this concept, a holistic approach of national security. And that holistic approach of national security is not only referring to food security and water security, but what really referring here is that China's pursuit for that sense of scientific and technology self-reliance, which again would complicate the relationship between China and in many other Asian economies, because ultimately the Asian countries will have to choose perhaps whether to follow the Chinese technology standard or adopt the Chinese technology on the one hand, vis-a-vis perhaps to follow the US standards in here. So I see the further complication will arise from the technology supply chain and also come from the technology standard setting. But that's also largely in line with China's whole notion on the national security, holistic approach of national security. So I think there's three things would rather not to really reduce the complication of China's relationship with the Asia-Pacific, but rather to increasing the complexity, and it will be much harder for the members of ASEAN and also for large number of multinational to be able to navigate through that complication in years to come. So a sense of bifurcation will continue, and how long that will last, and we don't really know. And I ended in here, and much look forward to hear your comments and questions.
Thanks a lot, Yuji. I think the technical problems were at my end, not yours, so apologies for that. Charles, I'd like to turn to you now. You're both a China scholar as well as wear a business hat now at the U.S. Chamber. So give us the geopolitical flavor as well as what the U.S. business community is expecting in terms of potential reset in relations with China. Whether you think that there's Bilahari mentioned there's a continuity in the approach that the administration has taken on trade. So what do you see reading the tea leaves in DC?
Reading the tea leaves in DC. Well, first of all, thank you, Suki, and thank Chatham House, and appreciate the ability to hear and interact with my colleagues Bilahari and Yijia. Let me just, if you look at the business community in the United States, I think for many years it's been the ballast in the U.S.-China relationship. When there have been strategic or challenges, whether it's the bombing in Sarajevo or the EP3 incident with the plane, the business community and the business relationship has always been the thing that has helped the two countries navigate difficult times. And the U.S. and other foreign business presence and relationships with China have been enormously successful for China. I think at some point, U.S. Or other foreign invested enterprises were producing 95% of China's exports, or were invested in exports equal to 95% of China's exports of higher tech goods and services. So it's been a pretty important relationship. And if you could look back, I think Bilahari raised the China's accession to WTO in 2001. If you look back at least from a perspective of a former U.S. trade negotiator, the emphasis on negotiations at WTO were all about limiting the ability of governments to interfere with enterprise-to-enterprise trade. And the great wonder of China, and the thing that got many of us excited, was not necessarily the convergence in political terms that meant, but in economic terms. Certainly, you saw China really move towards a very market-driven economy over the period of 15, 20 years. And many, if not most, of China's economic successes have come because of this embrace of the market and the rise of Chinese entrepreneurs. And that the second point I make is that in the wake of a lot of different things, some of which really spooked the Chinese government on moving towards a market-driven economy, the Chinese government has moved back into a position which is, at least on paper, plan-driven, heavy emphasis on government support, focus on key enterprises, reduction of the ability of other countries other countries' enterprises to compete in China's domestic market. These are I think understandable to the extent that China's government is trying to use different methods to avoid the middle income trap. But by and large, this is really reversing policies that both led China to great economic sense, plus ensured that there would be some convergence of economic systems in the global trading center. The problem, and a third point I would make about that is that, rather than the United States sort of standing firm and maintaining a focus on preserving a workable rules-based trading system, the United States seems to have opted for trying to match China at its own game. And increasingly, the United States is talking about domestic supports for both technology innovation and otherwise. And some of the trade policies that you hear out of the current administration in Washington sounds a lot more Chinese than classic U.S. Negotiating stance. So, I think in many respects, competition with China is driving a lot of policy in Washington in ways that are a bit surprising. On the economic front, there has been an emphasis again on, running faster. So the domestic economy would have to, run faster than the Chinese economy through innovation or otherwise. And so that requires government support, apparently. There is that limit on commercial interaction with China, particularly in technology areas, so that China doesn't gain the benefits of U.S. innovation, I suppose. So that's both controls on exports as well as limitations on investment in the United States. And then it's this very front and center effort to regain the trust of friends and allies, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific, which is, and as well as Europe and some friends in Latin America. That the effort is really on restoring American credibility. And I think the problem that the United States will run into as it attempts to compete with China for the hearts and minds of Southeast Asians and others, is that the administration still is operating a really ethnocentric American trade policy with a focus on kind of protection of American the American middle class who've had such a tough time over the past 15, 20 years. But really not as liberalized in its focus as it might be, and without a new TPP or rejoining of TPP or CPTPP by the United States, it's going to be really very, very hard for the Biden administration to make much headway in competition with China for that, for those hearts and minds. And that's particularly because, people in Southeast Asia, Japan, Korea, can read the election results in the United States and see that, there's no guarantee that we don't return to a much more Trump style of diplomatic interaction, which probably wouldn't go far in building friends and allies either. I'll stop there. I'll just say that effectively, as Yujia said about the Chinese development of a perception of national security, that idea of comprehensive national security that would include things like being technologically self-sufficient. The United States has long pushed back against this definition of national security to exclude technology and economic issues. And I think in addition to changing the way the United States thinks about an effective economy, it's also changed American thinking about national security. So now The economic and technology piece is very much part of U.S. approaches to national security as well. As a business person, all of this is a bit troubling because we've had many experiences in the past of governments, attempting industrial policies that help to stand up their domestic industries, and it's only rarely particularly effective, and a lot of waste is involved. So I fear that that because of Xi Jinping's pivot towards a much more self-reliant, less open and market-driven economic approach, that has actually infected U.S. policymaking. I should use that term advisedly. But essentially, China, I mean, the United States was always focused, as Billy Hari said, on changing China, or at least hoping that China's political system would change. It really seems to me that it's China that has changed the United States, perhaps for the longer term. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Charles. We've got lots of questions coming in. I'm going to cluster them. So let me ask you the first three questions. Welcome all the panelists, starting with Bilahari, to respond. If you believe in the legal proposition that possession is 9/10 of the law, I mean, do we look at China's island building over the last decade as one thing that fundamentally cannot be changed? So China's possession of all of these islands in the South China Sea. I know some Southeast Asian countries, of course, have contested this legally in the international arena. But realistically, does this essentially mean that China has possession over those islands? And that fundamental fact is going to remain unchanged. Now, linked with this is the role of Japan and Korea. And obviously, Bilahari, you raised the issue of nuclear deterrence. Now, how much does North Korea complicate this issue of nuclear deterrence, particularly if, sometime in the future, and, people have been saying near future for many, many years, and it has not happened, a potential reunification in the Korean Peninsula. What does that do to the nuclear balance of power in the region? So, let me start with Bilahari on these sets of three questions, and then welcome UGA and Charles.
Okay, let me be very brief. On the South China Sea, obviously, nobody is going to make the Chinese dig up those artificial islands and throw the sand back into the sea. That's not going to happen. On the other hand, those islands in a wartime scenario are useless because they'll be vaporized within the first 15 minutes, or if not half an hour. And they cannot and have not deterred the US and its friends and allies operating in, through, above the South China Sea. Indeed, it has provoked more countries to take an interest in what was once a rather obscure issue. Right? You even have Germany now saying it's going to send a frigate. France earlier this year did something quite significant. It sent a nuclear attack submarine to exercise in the South China Sea and announced that it was there. And that's quite significant because the South China Sea is one of the areas which the Chinese ballistic missile submarines have to navigate through to get to the Pacific. And that's a very strong signal. Now, North Korea is a done deal. They're not going to give up their nuclear weapons. Accept that. They are de facto a nuclear weapon state. And you have to deal with them on that basis. In other words, deal with the North Korean issue as an issue of arms control and not of denuclearization in whatever definition of that rather vague term. Now, of course, the US, everybody else is not going to give up denuclearization as an aspiration, right? But the reality is North Korea has to be dealt with as a nuclear weapon state, and you deal with a nuclear weapon state only in one way, by deterrence. What's the third question? I didn't. I've missed it. Vasuki? Your first question was South China Sea, second North Korea, and the third was what?
I mean, really looking at the role of other parties in North Asia, like Japan and Korea. And you already spoke
Japan
about
and
North Korea, but
I think have had their eyes open. I think Japan is one of the first countries to recognize that Mr. Trump was not just an aberration, but an extreme symptom of a new phenomenon. That's why Abe made a point to go there. Now, Mr. Biden says and has acted in a more consultative manner with friends and allies. But think of what is more consultation mean on the other side. The corollary of more consultation means more expectations. In other words, a more transactional approach in a more polite way. It's a different America, and friends and allies of the US have to step up to that. Japan recognized this first. It is acting more actively. It has changed its internal laws and administrative arrangements so that it can play a bigger role despite its constitution. Australia is inching that direction. And as I said, the UK wants to send its aircraft carrier. Even Germany wants to send a frigate, and so on. This is an example of what I mentioned in my opening remarks, that the premature abandonment of hiding your light and biding your time has in fact caused a coalition of countries with concerns about certain aspects of Chinese behavior. That's not a good thing for Chinese foreign policy.
Thank you. Eugene?
I think another key source, which Bahalari didn't mention in here, is that how much the sense of past grievances combined together with that sense of nationalism, really strong nationalism, push the Chinese foreign policy to a certain extreme. I mean, as we have experienced by the South China Sea, the island building. And I mean, part of the reason is because the public and also the PLA somehow lobbied the Chinese Communist Party in order to establish some sense of declared territory, just to show that sense of the obsession of territorial integrity and towards the Chinese and towards the Chinese foreign policy. So I think what we should really observe in here is that sense of really, nowadays, who can really dictate the Chinese foreign policy? Is it really done by diplomats or really done by growing angry population, and also plus ever stronger PLA, which acquire an even larger portion of military budgets in years to come. So I think that's part of the attribute of the South China Sea should become more and more complicated in here. Now, on the DPRK, I mean, I entirely agree with Bahalari in here. But I think the one thing we should really watch out is how the China-South Korea relations will play out in the next few years. And considering the background that President Moon is only have 1 year to go, and he seems to crafting some sense of a China-friendly policy. But how about his successor? Whether his successor will align with the United States more, and whether his successor will be follow the Beijing more. And I think that's a known question, and I'll be keen to watch that. But however, whatever China does, I think the Chinese interest for the DPRK, it is to maintaining the status quo, that treating DPRK continue to be one of the client state of China.
Just very briefly, I think one of the with respect to South China Sea and other actions by China that disturb or a regional sense of China's benevolence, these are things which should inure to the benefit of U.S. policy, but I'm not sure that the United States right now is capable of demonstrating the kind of benevolence in international affairs in the Asia-Pacific that it would really need to do in order to genuinely challenge the notion that in China, that China is rising in a way that would affect Chinese behavior in the South China Sea, in the Diaoyu Senkakus, in the India-China border, and otherwise. So at this point, Chinese behavior has been rewarded as opposed to challenged, so I think the United States has some work to do if it's if it's truly going to provide a reasonable alternative on the diplomatic front to China in the region.
Thank you. I mean, next cluster of three questions. The first one is very obvious, almost elephant in the room, is the issue of Taiwan. And, if you believe everything you read in the Twitter sphere, it seems imminent that China is going to take some action regarding Taiwan. And of course, one should not believe everything one reads in the Twitter sphere. But I'd like to get the panelists' views on, how is China calibrating its relationship vis-a-vis Taiwan. Linked with this is the broad issue of the Indo-Pacific. I think there's a huge amount of talk here in Washington, D.C. about the administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. Kurt Campbell has been designated as the point person on that. But what does this actually tangibly mean, really? And to Charles' point, what is the U.S. putting tangibly on the table in order to provide that alternative for Southeast Asian countries or the broader region in terms of this U.S.-China tussle, whose side they're going to be on? And the final point really is the point that UGA mentioned on Belt Road Initiative. And we see these two Chinas. We see the wolf warrior China, where China is breathing fire and brimstone, really taking a very hard, aggressive line against neighbors. And then, Belt and Road kind of has fallen off the agenda, at least in terms of, media focus, media attention. So, in this new reality, how is China, or how should China position itself in making itself more friendly and amenable to neighbors? So, Bilahari, can I start with you? So it's Taiwan, Indo-Pacific, Belt and Road.
Okay, Taiwan first. There are two crucial factors that we should keep an eye on Taiwan, and it's very hard to know how these factors will develop. First, what is the PLA telling Mr. Xi Jinping? Are they telling Mr. Xi Jinping, it's gonna be a breeze, boss, don't worry. Give us a few more years, it's ours. Or are they telling Mr. Xi Jinping, look, boss, we understand we cannot give up the military option, but this is difficult. An amphibious operation is the most difficult type of military operation, and we, the PLA, have zero experience in amphibious operation, and we don't know what the US is going to do. So why are they going to tell them? The second factor is Taiwanese domestic politics. Taiwan has been given more space, diplomatic space, not just by the United States, but by a number of countries, and I think that's a good thing. But do they know how to use that space wisely? Tsai Ing-wen knows. Tsai Ing-wen knows very well, and she has been very skillful in using that space without going too far. However, Taiwanese domestic politics is intrinsically volatile. You could get another Chen Shui-bian. Chen Shui-bian was essentially a small town politician who suddenly found himself the president and didn't know how to act. Or you could get another Lee Teng-hui, who thought himself as Moses, leading his people to the promised land. Now, the combination of these two factors, the volatility of Taiwanese domestic politics, and what on earth is the PLA telling Mr. Xi Jinping? There's a strong imperative in any bureaucratic system, and much more so in China under Mr. Xi, to tell the boss what you think the boss wants to hear. And that's very dangerous. Now, the BRI. The BRI, look, I'm talking about the maritime BRI because the land-based BRI through Central Asia is another issue. The BRI on the whole is a good thing, I think, because there is a need for infrastructure. It's quite clear that all the existing IFIs are not going to be able to meet that demand, and you need additional sources of infrastructure. But China, as a huge, as a growing and dynamic, and as a contiguous country to Southeast Asia, is always going to arouse anxieties. And some of the implementation of the BRI has been clumsy. Now, the BRI is, to my mind, a collection of projects wrapped up in a slogan presented as a strategy. And by the nature of it, some projects are going to work better than other projects, and that is what is actually happening. Some has been suspended, some have been canceled, some have been restructured, and there are some that are just not commercially viable. Now China is beginning to realize that deep as its pockets are, they are not infinite, and there has to be some kind of winnowing out of projects to make them viable. Lastly, and very briefly, the Quad. The Quad is yet another example of what I said, that China, by its behavior, is creating a coalition of countries with concerns. The Quad is much more coherent now under Mr. Biden than it was under Mr. Trump, because Mr. Trump's and Mr. Pompeo in particular idea of using the Quad for hard containment is not going to be accepted by even US allies like Japan. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, the characteristic attitude in this new period of international relations is ambivalent. Everybody has some concerns about China, but everybody has connections with China that they are not going to relinquish. And the Quad is one reflection of this. And under Mr. Biden, it has become more broader. It's not just about containment. It's also about vaccines. It's also about economics. And it is much more coherent. Where it will last in this way, I don't know. We'll just have to wait and see.
Thank you, Bilahari. UGA?
Sure. I start with the Taiwan question. I think Taiwan question is very much a legitimate issue for the Chinese Communist Party, and whether Xi Jinping will be able to resolve it within his term time, we really don't know. But I think what will be the beneficiary for China at this moment is to maintaining the current status quo of the cross-strait relations, because the danger of having a military escalation across the strait is just too grave. And then that would just essentially break down the Sino-US relations, which has two parts have been agreed back to 1979, is to maintain the current status quo of Taiwan Strait. So that's one thing. And secondly, I very much agree with Bilahari's insights regarding the volatile domestic politics of Taiwan. At this moment, I mean, what we found is both the incumbent president and also the leading opposition, it seems to have a converged view towards mainland China. So that is really a challenge for Beijing, because the room to maneuver, the room to using economic engagement to stabilizing cross-strait relations has been really reduced. Therefore, that will be putting Beijing in an incredibly difficult situation to handle Taiwan. And what I've noticed that in recent rhetoric from the Chinese Communist Party is that the whole word of the so-called peaceful reunification of Taiwan, the word of peaceful, has dropped. I mean, it obviously is signaling some kind of change in thinking within Beijing, but whether they're going to really taking any reaction, a real implementation for some sense of reunification, we don't know. I think let's not call it too early that Beijing is keen to increase any military interventions towards Taiwan. And that is not the consequences anyone in this world would like to see. Now, on the BRI, I think Chinese, after 7 or 8 years or so, and the Chinese government finally realized the Belt and Road is really not, a panacea that will be able to resolve the issue that China has with its neighbors, as well as with many other great powers from afar. And what China can really do is perhaps really to improve the sustainability of the current BRI projects, and firstly. And secondly, to present a narrative that the BRI, it is not about China's geopolitical ambition, but rather it is about how to building adaptable and affordable infrastructure, and somehow presenting and provoke a positive competition between that China's version of BRI and the vis-a-vis whoever come up with a different version of infrastructure. So somehow to crafting and constructing a positive competition will be more amenable towards China for China's improvement on the BRI. Now, Indo-Pacific, I mean, it's largely still very much ambivalent and geopolitical buzzword. And it really set a very strenuous test for Chinese diplomacy. And obviously, how are they going to deal with this encroachment towards China? Very difficult for Beijing. But then on the other hand, as I said earlier, because everyone is now having a slice of the Chinese economy and everyone is dealing with China one way to another. So that sense of really having some military escalation within Quad, it is not something thinkable. in my sense. So I think, yes, China has a very difficult card to play in here, but the strongest card still remain on the side of its economy to dealing with the Quad and various other challenges.
Thank you, Jay. Charles?
Yeah, thanks. So with respect to Taiwan, I think that, from a U.S. business perspective, Taiwan is a very important market for the United States and a very important hub in the global supply chain, particularly for semiconductors, which, as we've discovered, are something that we can't live without. And so, Taiwan is both a source of economic and commercial strength, as well as a potential flashpoint. And the only thing that one can hope for is that rational thought prevails, and particularly among the political class. That, as you just said, when in 1979, the U.S. and agreed to essentially leave it up to a choice of Chinese across the Taiwan Strait. We're 50 years into this thing, close to it, and that formulation is being challenged in both both Washington and Taipei. So again, we hope that rational thought prevails, because this is such an important economic part of the global economy. Anyway, with respect to BRI, I agree completely with Bilahari and Yujia. This is, the BRI is not the be all and end all of existence. It's a series of projects in the guise of a program, and I agree that the need for infrastructure in parts of the world that don't have it, means that the BRI has been a really good thing for many countries, but not every country. And I think that the challenge of having projects which do not have the scrutiny on the governance side as much as they might in a World Bank case, I think is going to hurt some countries down the road, because some of the projects are just not economically viable at this point. But I will say I'll tell a quick story as a way of illustrating how BRI has been successful, and that's in producing infrastructure which allows Chinese commerce and Chinese commercial standards to be distributed across the world. I have a friend who he was in Ethiopia, and he took the Chinese-built train to the Chinese-built airport and looked around for something to eat at the airport. And the most appetizing place was a Chinese noodle restaurant. And he went to go get some noodles, and he couldn't pay with either local currency or with U.S. style credit cards. The only thing he could use was Alipay, for the Alibaba payment system. So in many ways, that spread of infrastructure projects really does spread, Chinese commercial opportunities, unless the Chinese government curtails those opportunities by clipping the wings of its enterprises down the road. So I guess I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Now we're almost running out of time, but I'd like to welcome each one of our panelists to offer some closing remarks, perhaps on a more positive note on where do you see scopes for US-China collaboration? Is it on climate change? Is it on vaccines? Bilahari, can I start with you?
Well, climate change is an obvious one, and they're already working on it. How far it will go, we'll just have to wait to see. Vaccines is a potential area of collaboration. We shouldn't forget they did collaborate on fighting Ebola in Africa some years ago, and that's a good precedent. There are other things, I think, and rather counterintuitively maybe, I think the Middle East is an area where China and US have common interests, because the common interest is in stability. The US is not prepared to do what it was prepared to do in the past, but China seems inching towards doing more, and that's one area where they have a common interest. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Jay?
Well, climate change is obvious one. I'm not going to add in any more, but I think one area for potential collaboration would be outer space. As we even know the rows that Yang Jiechi and the Blinken had in Alaska, but the following day, actually, the US Congress agreed to letting NASA collaborating with the Chinese Space Agency to avoid providing data to avoid a waste also avoid clashes happen in outer space. So I think that's one of the area potentially, if anyone which want to avoid potential danger in outer space, that China unites can collaborate. And secondly, on vaccine, yes, I entirely agree with you in here. It is really an area for collaboration, because that will be beneficiary for the Chinese economy, and that will be really beneficiary and restore Americans' international image as well. So I think, yes, vaccine, they can definitely work together. These are the two areas. Yeah.
Thank you. Charles?
I hate to be cynical, Vasuki, but you live in Washington, and the mood about China is borders on paranoia at times. So I think even on something as obvious as climate change, or working together on global health situations, I think right now there's going to be a lot of resistance because of domestic politics, and particularly in the United States, but also in China. I mean, Yang Jiechi's blow up in Anchorage is part and parcel of a lot longer series of blowups, and it suggests that the opportunities for collaboration are going to be few and far between. That said, I'll be positive and say we're not at the end of history, and policies that emerge in Beijing and policies that emerge in Washington are subject to change, and there could be any number of things which drives the United States and China together. And my hope is all these UFOs that the U.S. Air Force is seeing are a source of external pressure that drives the U.S. and China together. I'm saying that as a joke, but in any case, I hope there's opportunity for collaboration on something.
On that sober note, ladies and gentlemen, we've run out of time. I'd like to thank our panelists for their excellent contributions today. I'd like to thank AIG. The next part of our AIG Chatham House webinar series will go on in the second half of July, where we'll focus on the impact of technology and climate change in greater depth. We'll keep you posted on when that is going to happen. So thank you all very much, and have a good day, and have a good evening, Bilahari.